is such a win. Hello and welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. We're going to be in the kitchen today doing something that I've personally never done before, but I've always wanted to do. We're going to make elderberry syrup. I'm going to be canning it, and we're also going to be making elderberry gummies. So we have our own elderberry trees. I actually have 3 different varieties. I'm not exactly sure what variety these berries came from, but this is only about half of the berries that we were able to harvest this year. It's gonna make a lot of syrup, which I think is really cool. Now what I did to get these berries ready to preserve is when I harvested the berries a few months ago, I actually just cut the ripe berry heads off of the plants, put them in a trash bag literally, and shoved them straight into the freezer. And when you do that, the berries just fall off of those heads or the stems really easily. And we have a gallon's worth here. For my master batch of elderberry syrup, I'm going to be using a recipe from Homesteading Family. I'm going to link their blog post on it in the description box below. Essentially, it's 1 part berries to 2 parts liquid. And because I have an entire gallon's worth of berries, I'm going to be putting 2 gallons worth of filtered water in the pot. Now my pot here, this is an 8-gallon pot. It is really overkill, but all my other pots only hold 2 gallons of liquid to the tippy top, and so that's not gonna work. So big pot it is. The elderberries and water is really all that's needed at this step. Later on, we're going to be putting in honey and lemon juice. But if you want, you can put in different aromatics like cinnamon and cloves, star anise. And so I have a couple different things I'd like to add, to include some fresh ginger. I'm not going to worry about peeling this because eventually we're just going to strain out everything and just be left with the juice. So I'm going to get this all shredded up and we're going to put that right on in along with our other aromatics. The original recipe calls for 4 cups of water, so essentially, because I'm using 2 gallons of water, I'm multiplying the recipe by 8, so this might seem excessive, but all of the cinnamon, I'm just gonna put it all in there. I won't be so heavy-handed with the cloves, though. A good pinch. 2 good pinches. And some star anise, or anise, however you say it. Oops. Nothing has even heated up yet and it smells lovely. But I did turn my stove on. I've got it on medium-high because admittedly I'm a little bit impatient when it comes to these things. But this super heavy-duty, thick-bottomed pot has saved me many a times from my impatience by not allowing anything to scald. I love it. So the goal here is to bring this up to a simmer and let things simmer for about 15 minutes. Okay, so our 15 minutes is up, and essentially what we have at this point is 2 gallons of elderberry tea. We want to reduce this down at this point to about half of the original volume. But first I need to take out all of the berries and all of the aromatics. So I have set up one of my smaller pots here with a damp tea towel. There's a colander in here. I'm just gonna be straining all of this out. You can really tell that the color of everything has really paled out. It's like all of the goodies that were in the berries have now left the berries and are in our tea here, which is exactly the point. Just squeezing what I can out of our aromatics and solids here. There's quite a bit of valuable juice still in there. It's very hot, so gloves absolutely help. I had thought that both of my smaller pots fit about 2 gallons in them, and this must fit about 2.5 gallons because all of that went in there. It's beautiful, lovely, dark tea. Now, as I mentioned before, I've got to reduce this down by half to turn this tea into a syrup. And it's going to work out faster, even though this pot does fit all of the current tea in it right now. The surface area on this larger pot is going to allow for a quicker evaporation. So I am going to transfer everything back over here and do the reduction in this pot. I am scared of picking it up. Okay, I think I'm gonna ladle, and then when there's a little less liquid in it, I will pour it over. I'm too scared of spilling it. I'm really good at spills, so. I hope the camera is picking up that color. That is gorgeous. I wonder if I could dye fabric with this. I bet I could, and I bet one of you knows. Or yarn. Ooh. So I did crank the temperature back up to high. I am gonna leave the lid off of the pot so that the liquids can properly evaporate and reduce this down by half. Look what the syrup did to my towel here. Even if I make a mess, I have a feeling I'm gonna have fun cleaning it up. So all the syrup is reducing and doing its thing. I am gonna portion out the honey. So I am not actually going to sweeten all of the elderberry syrup that I'm making today. Half of it I'm going to can, and half of it I'm going to turn into gummies. And the half that I'm going to can, I am not going to put honey in immediately. And that's because the canning process is going to heat up the syrup and the honey so much that it's going to take out the good properties of my raw honey. And this honey is really valuable to us. This is honey that we harvested here from our very own bees, and I don't want to basically kill it. The recipe that I'm using called for 2 cups of honey, and because we are multiplying that by 8, that's going to be 16 cups of honey, which is an entire gallon. And that's if I were to sweeten the entire batch. Because I'm only going to sweeten half of the batch, I'm only going to be grabbing out a half gallon of honey today. And the honey inside of this bucket, it's actually quite hysterical. It's going to be very easy to scoop out because it is the consistency of wet sand. Oh, it smells lovely. It's actually a lot less sandy than I remember, which is interesting, but you can see it's kind of clumping up there. This honey is actually crystallized, which does happen quite often with raw honey. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. It's just a little bit older, and what happens is over time, the honey will crystallize around the pollen that is in the raw honey. And when you've got kind of a lot of pollen content in your honey, sometimes you can get a lot of crystals. I'm bending my scooper here. If you don't have this much honey, or you don't want to use this much honey, you can use maple syrup. You can also use just plain sugar too. Oh man, this lid is hard to get off and it's hard to get back on. All right, so this has been simmering for quite some time, reducing, and we are officially at reduced by half. So when I started out this batch, the level of the liquid was right at the top of the spatula here, and now we're halfway down. So I am very happy with that. Now the recipe calls for a 1/4 cup of lemon juice to acidify things. It also adds a little bit of flavor as well. Because I am multiplying by 8, I'm gonna put 2 cups of lemon juice in here. So now, as I mentioned, I am not going to add the honey right now. Doing so would kill a lot of the good enzymes and things that are in the raw honey. So I'm going to set aside half of this to cool down, and the other half we're going to can. As you can see, it's really quite liquidy. From what I understand, the elderberry syrup, the syrup quality really comes from when you add the sugar or the honey, and that was a lot of honey that we had over there, so I believe that it would thicken up quite a lot. So I filled up this half-gallon jar to the absolute tippy top, which I'm not sure if you were aware, but all of these types of jars, this is a pint jar, over here I have a quart jar. This is not the quart level. A lot of people assume that the beginning of the neck is where you're at a full quart. It's not. It's actually the very tippy top of the jar is the quart measurement, or the half-gallon measurement, or the pint measurement. So as expected, this is measuring at about 175 degrees, which is way too hot for our honey. So we're gonna set this aside to cool. I'm using my steam canner to can up the elderberry syrup today. Now this is a little bit of rebel canning, not the steam canner itself, but there's no, as far as I know, there's no FDA or USDA approved recipes for canning elderberry syrup. I'll explain to you a little bit of why I'm okay with it, and then you can make that determination for yourself. Part of the reason I'm okay with it is I know that elderberries are very, very close to being as acidic as tomatoes. and then we have added twice the amount of lemon juice that is required to acidify something like tomatoes, I'm comfortable doing it. So you can decide for yourself. Otherwise, you can absolutely store this in the refrigerator for up to about 6 months. If you've never seen anybody use a steam canner before, you can use a steam canner exactly like you would a water bath canner. This is an approved method for canning, and with any recipe, you just use the same times that you would a water bath canning recipe. I do have a video about how exactly the steam canner works and how to use it, and I'll link that video at the end of this one. The thing that I love most about it is that it is extremely fast, and if you have a lot of canning to do in a day, you can crank out a lot with just this one canner. So I realized that I think the gelatin is going to dissolve better in the liquid if I dissolve it while it's still pretty hot, too hot for my honey. So I'm going to create more dishes for myself, as you do. Okay, so all the recipes that I have seen online for the gummies give you about a ratio of 1/4 cup gelatin per cup of elderberry syrup. And that does include elderberry syrup with honey in it. So I've got a 1/2 gallon of honey, I've got a 1/2 gallon of the syrup here, so that is equal to 1 gallon. So I'm looking for around 4 cups of gelatin. This is making me a little bit nervous, but know that I don't post videos if it doesn't work out in the end. So if you're seeing this, it worked out and it wasn't a problem. So I've got as much gelatin as I had in the house. Now it's not quite 4 cups, it's about 3.5 cups, but it's gonna have to do. And I have a feeling this is gonna cool it down quite a lot. So that did cool it down quite a bit, but not enough. I am looking for a target temperature of 100 degrees or below. Otherwise, adding honey to hot liquid like that, it's gonna break down some of the enzymes, and like I mentioned before, I don't wanna do that. So the honey's all worked in, and I wanna move quickly at this point because I can tell as the gelatin starts to cool down that we are thickening up. So right here is one of my freeze dryer trays with this cool little insert that I got from Harvest Right. I guess you can freeze dry cubes of like broth, or I've done milk before. I've done quail eggs in these before in the freeze dryer, but I thought that these would be a really good mold for our gummies. I measured, and one of these little cubes is about 2 teaspoons. So in order to like dose our kids, I'll just be cutting 1 cube in half and it'll be perfect. So this is probably about half of the gummies that we were able to get from our gummy part of the batch. They are absolutely perfect. When they first came out of the mold, they were a tiny bit sticky, so I had considered rolling them in a little bit of cornstarch so they wouldn't stick together, but they're doing awesome. They're not sticking together. Let's see if I can kind of show you the consistency. I guess I could just bite it. Perfect. I was definitely hoping for that type of consistency. So in order to get them firm like that, I did refrigerate them overnight, and then they popped out of the mold very easily this morning. So here we have the gummies that I put in the molds. It made quite a few of them, but I also put some of the gel in a tray like this so that you could see how it works out if you don't happen to have a mold like I do. So I've got probably about a 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit more as far as depth goes in this tray. Everything is solidified. This sat in the refrigerator overnight with the rest of the gummies. I'm just gonna take a regular knife and cut out some squares. Sorry for the noise, my AC just kicked on in the background. But as you can see, no fancy mold needed. These cut out of the mold perfectly, or they cut out of the pan perfectly. I didn't add anything to the bottom of this, no oil or anything to help them release, and it came out quite nicely. This is such a win. I am so excited. So this batch that we made of elderberry gummies specifically, my husband did a little bit of math, and if we each take half a gummy a day, this is gonna last us about 4 months. Now, of course, when we're sick, we can up that dosage to a few gummies per day each person. I am going to include dosage guidelines in the description box, so if you're a little bit unsure about that, go ahead and visit that. Take a screenshot, write it down, whatever you need to do. So that's the gummy portion. And don't forget, we did can some of the elderberry syrup. So this is actually pre-syrup. This is more of that concentrated juice. And in order to create elderberry syrup out of these, whenever I'm ready, what I'm going to do is mix 1 part elderberry syrup starter to 1 part honey. So what I'm going to end up with is a pint of honey and a pint of this starter put together for elderberry syrup is going to equal 1 quart of elderberry syrup. We've got 6 of these pint jars here. So this is going to equal, once the honey is added, another 1.5 gallons of syrup. So this was a lot. You don't have to make such a big batch, but I figured if I was going to do it, I was going to do it big so that I didn't have to do it as often. Not everybody has access to an entire gallon's worth of elderberries, and having said that, what I used in the recipe was frozen elderberries. So the recipe calls for, I think the original recipe is 2 cups of either fresh or frozen elderberries, or 1 cup of dried elderberries. And that is often how you can buy elderberries online if you don't have access to fresh or frozen. They come dried, and when the elderberries dry, they take up less volume because, you know, they shrink as they dry, and so you're going to use about half as much of the dried elderberry as you would fresh elderberry in the recipe. If you were to refrigerate this instead of can it, this syrup here, it's going to last about 6 months in the refrigerator. Obviously watch it, especially if you add the honey up front. Honey does last indefinitely, but when you dilute it, when you take your honey above the about 19% moisture that makes it last forever, you do risk the honey starting to ferment and starting to be able to break down a lot faster. So watch it. I am going to assume that the same is true for the gummies. This is my first time making these, but logically it makes sense that they would last just as long in the refrigerator as the fresh syrup, so I'm going to assume so. Again, all of this was made with just 1 gallon's worth of fresh elderberry, which would have been 1/2 gallon's worth if you were to buy it dry. And this is going to go a really long way for our family during this cold and flu season. I mentioned before that I would direct you to my steam canning video. I'm going to leave that up here. And if you happen to be interested in our honey harvest, I'll link our video from last year.